Now, I'm not much of a risk taker. In fact, I don't like to gamble. Well, maybe for the odd times that I'm at my grandmother's house and we're playing Texas Hold'em with the family. But aside from that, we get a lot of calls here at PCA headquarters where people are hoping to realize their Porsche dream. In fact, many of you PCA members that are watching probably get that same question. And I have to sometimes chuckle because I look at what the people are driving and think to myself, they probably can realize that Porsche dream. Take, for example, this 2014 Jetta behind me. This car, when it was new, as well as other economy cars out there on the market, they're about $20,000 to $25,000 when you buy them, and that's a healthy budget. And what I'm here to tell you is you can realize your Porsche dream with that budget and buy yourself a great Boxster as well as a 911. And so what we've done is we've brought some resident experts to tell you and show you how you can buy a Boxster and buy a 911 and buy it right and realize your Porsche dream before it becomes a nightmare. We told you about possibly utilizing your budget of $20,000 to $25,000 to get yourself that dream Porsche, be it a Boxster or a 911. But buying the car right is oh so important. So today we brought in some experts. We have Jake Raby from Flat Six Innovations, and we have Charles Navarre from Ellen Engineering. Now between the two of them, they have at least 40 years of experience with Porsches, but more specifically, they have lots to share with us today about the Boxsters, the early Boxsters, as well as the 996. Now, there's no true standard for pre-purchase inspection. For me, if it's a free pre-purchase inspection, unless you're really good friends with the person that's doing it, it's probably not a thorough pre-purchase inspection. But what you guys are finding out to really be able to dig in and find out the condition or the bill of health of these cars, you're spending a day with them.
Absolutely.
So you spend a day with them, what are you looking at?
Well, from an engine perspective, that's the main thing. Of course, as an engine developer, especially with these engines, we learned that there are a lot of secrets that we can find with the health of the engine from debris that we find in the oil sump, debris we find in the oil, in the filter housing. Those are very important aspects. I call the oil sump the window to the soul of the M96 engine. We find this debris or this material, different colors and shapes and sizes and different types of materials that give us an idea of what may be failing. And we find that before the engine has a problem like a knock or something like that.
All right, as we said, a pre-purchase inspection is definitely a good thing to do when you're getting ready to buy your car. Now, there are certain things that a typical pre-purchase inspection can cover. And Jake, you can kind of show me a little bit around here. What have you noticed so far in this 996?
Well, so far I see a good bit of oil seepage from the rear main seal area. This is wet. It looks like it's been there for a long time. So I'm not real concerned with that, but it's just something to note as you're moving forward. I see a little bit of oil seepage around other places. I also notice this is a very early car, very early engine. It has the earliest of all sump plates, which tells me that it probably has the original engine in the car because those were updated later on. I also see an oil leak from the Bank 2 cam cover. Doesn't appear to be that bad. It could be a spark plug tube, could be in need of some sealant. Other than that, I don't really see anything that makes me just jumps out at me. I'm going to look at the water pump also while I'm here. And you can see that it's the same color as the crankcase. So this is the water pump flange and the crankcase is here. This hasn't been changed in a long time. So it's not like somebody just changed a water pump because there might have been a problem they're trying to hide by changing a water pump because the old one failed. I don't think that's the case because everything looks the same age on the water pump. But I would say you want to change the water pump on the car when you pick it up probably.
Preventative maintenance.
Absolutely, because it's probably been there for a long time, or it might be the original water pump.
Okay, so that's what you can see just by looking on the outside. But we've talked about is a thorough pre-purchase inspection. You're going to want to dive into the motor, into the sump. So what are we going to do next?
Next, we'll drain the oil, and then we're going to pull these perimeter bolts off, and we're going to drop the sump plate down, and we'll be able to see basically that window to the soul of the M96 engine. Okay, so next we're going to drain the engine oil. And you have to be ready for a pretty big release of oil because you're draining close to 10 quarts all at one time.
Now this car also has a magnetic drain plug. Now that's not stock.
No, this has been upgraded to a magnetic drain plug, which is a very good thing to do because this keeps debris from ever even making it to the oil filter. So you have to remember that for oil to get to the filter, it must first go through the oil pump. So by protecting, upgrading to this, you protect the oil pump from debris. And this one is a very clean magnet. It's got a little debris on it, but it's always going to have some of that, like a little haze of debris across the top.
And what's that debris from? Just the engine running and wear?
Normal and expected wear. I mean, I would consider this to come from timing chains, sprockets, maybe a little bit from an IMS bearing. Anything that's ferrous in the engine, even piston rings, could be shed in small amounts and collected on this magnet.
Okay, so before we take off the 13 bolts here for the sump plate, we did just use a little bit of brake clean and sprayed it down, clean off the debris. Also, I didn't know, but I discovered the motor number there. See, you can see M96, and that tells you 0166W05506. You can kind of put two and two together and know that this is probably the original engine that came with the car and not a later replacement.
Yeah, and it's definitely the correct engine designation because it's an early 99 built in 98. That's an M96/01 engine, so that's the first generation. If the car was a few months newer, it was a later 99, or if it's a Tiptronic, it may be an M96/02.
02, okay. All right, well, let's break these bolts and
we'll get started.
Very little torque on those, huh?
Yes, only about 10 Newton meters.
So if you're attempting this job, you definitely want to have a torque wrench so that when you put it back together, you torque it off correctly.
Absolutely.
Now I noticed some of the bolts, when you tried to put the socket on, it didn't fit very well because these bolts unfortunately have bottomed out on something, or a rock or something have hit it, and it's not exactly a 10 millimeter, so we'll have
Exactly. Yeah, a couple of them have had some impact, like this one. Something's hit it. I got it to go on, but it was kind of tough.
Right.
One over there, it wouldn't go on at all, so we'll have to improvise something on that one. Okay, so the next step is we're going to pry down the sump plate. The glue on this, the sealant, can be quite aggressive, and there's a pry point on the bank 2 side of the sump. Okay, so to familiarize you with the parts you're going to find inside the engine's oil sump, this is the engine oil pickup tube. This is where 100% of the engine's oil will be picked up and make its way to the oil pump and the filter and then out to the rest of the engine. These are the swirl pots. There's one here for bank 2, one here for bank 1. Their job is to de-aerate the engine's oil. So as the oil is utilized and picked up by the scavenge pumps at each one of the cylinder heads respectively, that oil is then internally routed back through the engine down to the parting line where it goes up this tube and then over and down into a swirl pot, where this swirl pot will work to de-aerate the oil as it travels in a tangential flow that returns it back to the bottom of the oil sump. So this is in hopes to remove that harmful aeration from the oil that occurs during the normal operation of a horizontally opposed engine. So we're looking a little bit further, and I see a lot of debris has been collected in the oil pickup tube screen. So it was clear when we started working with this car, somebody had the sump plate and one of the cam covers off at some point, and they utilized the wrong sealant on that particular surface. And they also used way too much of it, which we can show you in a little bit closer photo in a second. But I noticed that some of that debris has made its way into this pickup tube. And I'm just going to take my finger and run it around the perimeter of this to see if I can find any more of that debris. So we want to collect the debris out of the pickup tube before we move forward.
Cool.
Next step is we're going to have to clean all the old sealant off. They used the wrong sealant and they used way too much of it. So I've got a razor blade scraper here. I'm going to come in at about a 45-degree angle, and I'm just going to scrape this entire perimeter of the sump plate all the way around to remove this old sealant. One thing we want to do here is we want to remove these rubber baffles from the sump plate before we start to clean it, because these can be harmed by any solvent that you may use. So we just want to remove that from each side. Okay, so now we've taken the time to clean up the sealing surface of the sump plate. We've also inspected it to make sure it's not bent, warped, or damaged in some way. And we're going to be installing this back on the engine after we take a few minutes to clean up the sealing surface of the engine as well. Okay, so now we're ready to reinstall our engine oil sump cover plate.
Well, Jake just finished going over, pulling the sump, inspecting, cleaning it, resealing it, putting it back together. So we're just going to do a general overview of the underside of the vehicle to see what's stock, if something's been changed. Quick glance, we look up. Straight up through here are the engine mounts. There's one right here, and located on the other side of the car is the other engine mount. It's a fluid mount, so when they go bad, you'll see oily mess up there, and also the engine will drop on the side that the engine mount is bad. There's one other mount on a 996 transmission mount, and it's located underneath this deflection panel, so down here. And there's a rubber insert in it. When the rubber insert, that's what you want to look at. All the rubber inserts on the mounts, on the control arms. Like on the control arms, you can see here, there's a rubber insert in here. You want to see if that's torn. So obviously when you're doing the test drive, if something feels loose or doesn't feel right, there's a shimmy or you hear a noise or there's a shake, when you have the car up in the air, you obviously go look at the control arms, look at the bushings. Also, as you can see, shock has been replaced. It's not a factory shock. It has a set of Bilsteins on it. The springs also look newish, so they're probably not the original springs. They're probably some aftermarket lowering spring, because the car did look lower when it was on the ground. It has an aftermarket sway bar. You can see it has aftermarket urethane bushings in it. Still has a factory drop link. It's common to find the sway bar changed out and have adjustable drop links. Also, while you're down here, all the hoses. You just want to do squeeze tests on the hoses. You want to look if they've got an oil on them. They'll get really soft and jelly feeling. They will fail at that point. So you want to just visually check all the hoses, make sure all the hoses look good, that none of them are squishy. So yeah, you got hoses everywhere. So you're just checking, make sure everything's healthy. We're not expecting to find anything because this car has been running great. It wasn't leaking any fluids. This car still has what looks to be original catalytic converters. You want to knock on them, make sure they're not loose. Sometimes if the catalytic converters are bad, they'll sound like marbles in a coffee can where the element has broken free inside, and that'll cause all kinds of problems with running of the engine. Also, you want to inspect the CV boots. There's no tears in these, there's no grease that's been slung. The other thing you want to do, you want to check for plunge on the axle. It's not binding, it feels pretty good. And you can do the same on the other side. Feels good. CV boots look good. Happy there. Transmission doesn't appear to have any leaks on the casing anywhere. Now we're back to the front of the car. Same things we were checking in back. Go to the control arms. You look at the rubber bushings in here, make sure there's no tears. Again, when I drove this car, drove great. I had no reason to think there's something wrong with the suspension. You also have all the other steering components, suspension components. You want to check the boots, make sure that they're not torn. This car has an aftermarket sway bar. It has adjustable drop links in it, aftermarket. it would appear the brake lines are original. It hasn't been fitted with stainless brake lines. That's something you might want to consider as these cars are getting older. Usually it's hard to find a spec for the brake hoses, but it's regarded every 10 years that it's a good idea to replace the brake hoses. Now that we brought the car down a little bit, one of the things you always want to check for, leaf debris, trash in the radiator intakes. What can happen, you can get cigarette butts, paper, leaves, grass clippings, and they get caked in and will reduce the cooling system capacity, make the engine run hotter. So it's common for this to happen. It's real easy to take care of. The front bumper actually comes off of these cars fairly easily, and you can back flush. You don't want to stick the hose into the opening. You're just going to jam all the dirt and the leaves further into the radiators. You actually have to back flush all the debris out. Also, if the AC is not working very well, it's probably also because you have leaves in there, because these cars have great air conditioning. Enough so that on some models like the GT3, they only put one condenser, not two condensers on the cars, and the AC still work great. Also, they added a chin spoiler onto this car for aero. Maybe they took the car to the track. We could obviously, when we interrogate the ECU, we can pull out average mile per hour, and we can kind of get an idea if the car was tracked or if it was just a street car. Something else this car is missing, it doesn't have a center radiator. That's a common upgrade that you can add to the car. On street cars, the center radiators exit down under the car. Where you see on GT3s, typically you'll have what they call a smile, or you'll have cuts in the front bumper, and the ductwork actually exits the air to the top of the car to help with additional downforce. Also, looking at the front of the car, this car was fitted with Lightronics. Either it was ordered that way, which we can check. There's the build sticker under the hood will have all the options the car was originally equipped with. Cars can also be retrofitted with Lightronics, but what a lot of people are doing nowadays, LED conversions for the halogen headlights have become very inexpensive and work very well. Good benefit of that also is they run cool, because it's often just that you see cars with the halogen headlights that someone's put the incorrect wattage bulb into the headlight, and it'll actually discolor and melt the lens. So obviously this car has been very well maintained. There's no discoloration of the lens, but they do make kits to clean and clear up the lenses if they do get discolored, because the headlights are very, very expensive. It's like $3,000 or $4,000. Okay, looking at this particular car, see it has an aftermarket wheel on it, or a factory option. I've never seen this particular combination before, but it definitely does not have all-season tires. This has a R-rated, it has a tread wear of 60. Definitely this is something that you wouldn't want to drive this car when it's below 50 degrees outside on these tires. It'd be a very rough ride, and you end up, if you store it in cold temperatures, the tires will flat spot. So this is something, if you do want to put a super high performance tire on your car that get a second set of rims in the winter, then you put winter tires in the car so the cold temperatures won't affect the tires. And looking here, the brake calipers, it's normal. Some of the clear coat on the calipers has fallen off. It's very common, age of the vehicles. If the cars have been tracked, the black calipers will get a grayish color. If it has red calipers, they'll turn like a brown color when they've been tracked because they've gotten hot. Something else you look for, the actual brake pad, the pads in there. The brakes look good here. We see no cracks. You don't want to have any cross-linking of the holes in the rotors. That's a bad thing. Also, you don't want cracks that go from the holes to the outer edge of the rotor. Again, these rotors don't have that. And the pads, there's plenty of meat. Usually the minimum thickness that you want to run is the thickness of the backing plate of the pad. At that point, it's time to change the pads. Okay, we're in the rear now. Again, we're checking the brakes. Rotors look great. There's no cracks in the rotors. Looking at the pads, it has plenty of pad left. It probably has over 50%. One consideration you want to look at, again, if the car has been tracked, the calipers in back will get hotter than the calipers in front. And that's because of the Porsche stability management. It uses the brakes to control the handling of the car. And typically with cars with PSM and traction control, that the rear brakes get exercised more than the front brakes. So they run hotter, so you tend to wear out more pads in the rear than the front, which is counterintuitive, but that's something you look for. Another consideration on the rotors, that these are cross-drilled, like I mentioned on the front, but you can also get slotted rotors. There's aftermarket rotors available that don't have cross-drilling, because cross-drilling the rotors does increase the chance of them cracking. So for performance applications, it's common to find rotors that are slotted. They last longer and don't have the same flaws that cross-drilled rotors can have. Okay, we have engine bay here. Has anything been modified? I can see that some kind of aftermarket intake boot has been put on, but it still has a factory air box. It's quite possible it might have a reusable air filter element in there. There's no problem with that. There's no cold air intake in here. We like seeing stock air boxes. They filter better. Also, another thing to check for, here's the coolant reservoir. You want to make sure that there's no sign that any of the plastic seam welds are leaking. You'd find coolant crusted and below it, around it. You can pull the oil cap off. If the car's been driven in colder climates, short drives, it's common for there to be sludge of some sort, white filmy residue in there, and the oil fill tube also has the same residue, and that's perfectly normal. Once the warmer season comes around, cars are driven more often, the oil gets to 210 degrees, the moisture will vapor off, and this will go away. We've removed the coolant reservoir cap, and what we're looking at in here is to see if there's any oil or oily residue floating at the surface of the coolant. There shouldn't be any. There isn't in this one, so we don't see any signs of early intermix. Everything looks great. We've checked the film under the cap. The other thing we're going to do is pull the oil fill tube up. Usually these crack down here, causing a vacuum leak, which will end up enriching the motor, and in the long run is bad for the motor, and also it will reduce your fuel economy. But if there's a crack here, you'll typically find oil or oily residue directly underneath it. So it's perfectly dry in there, so we know there's no problem with this oil fill tube. The drive belt for the accessories, it looks good from this side, but realistically the rib side is what we need to look at. And also there are tools that most service shops will have to check the tension on the belt and determine if the belt needs to be replaced. But typically we already saw from underneath that the water pump is original on this motor and it's due for a water pump. It'd be a good idea to replace the water pump, the thermostat, and also the drive belt at the same time. Okay, now we're in the front of the vehicle. So like I mentioned before, you can check the build options on the car. There's a tag under the hood. If the hood's been replaced or repainted, typically this is missing. But it's on here. There's websites you can go to on the internet that will help you decode what options this car had originally. Also, just taking a quick glance up here, this car has the factory trim piece missing from this area. It's common to have that removed. It kind of gets in the way when you're servicing the vehicle. So someone removed it permanently in this car. Here's the cabin air filter. Easy to change with that plastic trim piece gone. Again, this is something that for your own health, you should probably replace it maybe every 2 years. Take a look at it. They get dirty really fast. Battery, you can see this isn't the original Porsche battery. It's a replacement battery. It's actually a little bit shorter than the factory battery, which are longer, but the hold down is there. Want to make sure the battery, you want to make sure the battery is secured. Battery terminals, make sure they're tight. It's common if cars also have been autocrossed or tracked, the rules require the battery terminals to be covered. And what most people do is take racer's tape and put tape over the battery terminals. We're going to check the brake fluid. Again, this car doesn't look like it has some track upgrades on it, but I don't think anyone really has tracked it heavily. It's common to find if someone's tracked one of these cars, they'll take a paper towel, wrap it around the cap, and zip tie it. Because what happens, the brake fluid gets hot, it'll end up weeping, and the brake fluid gets out, makes a mess. So a lot of people just wrap that paper towel around the cap. You can see it still has, there's a little filter screen in there, so when you're putting the brake fluid in, you keep the contaminants out of the brake fluid. Again, if the car has been tracked, you're supposed to change the brake fluid, flush it every event. On a street car, you're supposed to do the brake fluid every 2 years. And you make sure you use a .4 rated brake fluid when doing that. And there's plenty choices. You have the factory Porsche fluid, there's Motul products, there's Castrol SRF. Again, the internet is your friend. There's plenty of forums, people who that track their cars. Everyone has an opinion on what's the best brake fluid, but as long as it's .4 brake fluid, you're great.
Okay, so we've got the Durametric diagnostic tool attached to the car just on a trusty laptop here. Got the ignition switch on. Engine is not running. We're just doing some basic checks now. We will fire the engine up and get some actual values in a few minutes. Here you can see our over revs. This car, being a 996, only has 2 ranges of over revs, 1 and 2. Later cars go all the way to 6. So basically, this particular engine has had several range 1s. These are ignitions that have been arrested by the DME. So these are basically just meaning that you hit the rev limiter. You didn't mechanically over rev the car. The last one of those was at 3,577 hours on the particular car we have here. So here you see that we have 3,636 hours on the car. So basically a little bit less than 100 hours ago, we had the last one of these over rev incidences where the rev limiter was hit, just shifting between gears. Range 2 ignitions are 0. This means the car has never been mechanically over revved. Nobody's missed a downshift. They haven't mechanically over revved the engine, and this is what we care about. Typically, I don't care that much about the stage 1s because those are very minimal as far as what they would do damage-wise. You'd have to have tens of thousands of these to have a big problem. But here, there's no ignitions in range 2. Okay, so we've changed our selection for what we want to watch for an actual value to the camshaft angle on bank 1 and camshaft actual angle on bank 2. So what we're doing here is making sure that both the cams advance and retard at the same rate, and then that they stay advanced at the same type of position together. So we're going to be making sure that this crank angle is the same. So I'm going to rev the engine up. And we can see that it's tracking very closely. And when I hold it at 1 RPM, that we are very close. This is very good. And then as it returns back to idle, we'll watch it again, and they'll stabilize at about 1 degree of crank angle between the two.